Hello, welcome to the 6th edition of our video history of Leicester City as told through its memorabilia and archives. Today we're going to be looking at the 1940s. This was an incredibly dramatic decade for the club. It started off with the club being at war. Filbert Street was bombed by the Luftwaffe. Later on it was damaged by fire. The club nearly went out of existence after inquiries into a financial scandal, and the decade ended with Leicester City reaching its first ever FA Cup final against all the odds. A dramatic decade indeed. After the outbreak of war, as we saw last week, the Football League was suspended. Players' contracts were cancelled, but the decision to carry on playing football in wartime regional leagues was taken, and clubs started using guest players. A very famous guest player, one of the most famous players in England, did actually offer to play for Leicester City as a guest in November and December 1939, and that was Tommy Lawton, who is the England and Everton centre forward. He'd in fact won the league championship with Everton the previous summer. Tommy Lawton's letter to the club can be seen here. It sets out his conditions for coming to the club. He did in fact play 3 games for Leicester City, scoring 5 goals. 1940 was a very bad year for Leicester City. Not only were crowds very small for the new wartime regional leagues, in May 1940, at the time of the Dunkirk evacuation across the Channel, the FA conducted an inquiry into alleged financial irregularities by the club, and this was serious. As a result of this inquiry, all but 2 directors were initially suspended for between 3 to 5 years, and later on in the year 12 of the players were suspended for a full year, which actually ripped the heart out of the club. The club really was in danger of going out of existence. Things got worse. On November the 14th, 1940, the Luftwaffe bombed Filbert Street, damaging the main stand badly. This was on the night of the big raid of Coventry. The club was in big trouble, but a recovery started to be effected by 2 new directors. One was Len Shipman and the other was Alf Pallett, who owned this big factory on Abbey Lane. It was the Castleoid factory. 1940-41 wasn't a bad season for Leicester City on the field. They signed 2 youngsters from Wolverhampton Wanderers who became big names in the English game in later years. They were the future England captain, Billy Wright, seen here on the left, and future England international winger Jimmy Mullen, seen here on the right. With these 2 players in the side, the club almost made its first Wembley appearance, because later on that season they reached the semi-final of the War Cup, where they were defeated in a 2-legged tie by Arsenal, thus being deprived of the opportunity to play at Wembley for the first time in the club's history in the Wartime Cup final. The following week, though, they did win a trophy. They won the Wartime Midland Cup, seen here. This is now in the trophy cabinet at the club, when they defeated Walsall at Filbert Street. The 1941-42 season saw further success on the field. They won another trophy on Christmas Day. This was. They won the Wartime Southern League Championship, and here we've got a picture of Sepp Smith and Tom Bromillow, the manager, with the trophy. In the summer of 1942, the club suffered the blow of a fire, damaging part of the old main stand, which had been damaged by the Luftwaffe a couple of years earlier, remember. And here we see Sepp Smith training in front of the burnt out frame of the old main stand. Later in the war, Leicester City took over, or entered into an arrangement with, a club up north called Middlesbrough Swifts, and they used it as a nursery club. And in June 1944, the month of the D-Day landings, Leicester signed a youngster from Middlesbrough Swifts who became a big name, not only for Leicester City but in English football generally. They signed a youngster called Don Revie. Although the war finished in 1945, the first post-war season didn't see the restoration of the Football League. The old wartime league arrangement still continued. In June 1945, between VE Day and VJ Day, Leicester City appointed new manager Tom Mather, who had made his name before the war as a manager of Stoke City and Newcastle United. The coach at Leicester City throughout the war, and he continued to work with Tom Mather, was Jack Butler, seen here on the back row wearing a collar and tie of this team photograph of the Leicester City side for that first post-war season. He had actually been the manager of the Belgian national side during the 1930s. Although the Football League wasn't restored for that first post-war season, the FA Cup was, and here we've got the Leicester City side waiting to catch a train from Leicester to go to Chelsea to play in the club's first cup tie for 7 years. They drew 1-1 at Stamford Bridge. It was a two-legged tie, but they lost 2-0 at Filbert Street. That season, Tom Mather had signed a big name for Leicester City. His name was Frank Su. He was an England international. He was the first player of Chinese heritage to actually play for England. But although he was a big name, before the end of that season, in March 1946, both Mather and Frank Su had left Filbert Street. Mather was replaced by Johnny Duncan. He was the captain of that famous side in the 1920s, which very nearly won the league, and here you can see him sitting at his desk at Filbert Street. And one of the first things Johnny Duncan did was to track down, because they'd lost touch with him during the war, Mal Griffiths, and they re-signed him. And here you've got Mal Griffiths shaking hands with Sepp Smith, watched by Willie Frame, two of his new teammates, or old teammates really, because he was rejoining them. The winter of 1946-47 was very harsh. This photograph was taken during that harsh winter. You can see Joe Calvert in the trilby hat and the cigarette, Don Revie and Mal Griffiths signing a young lad's autograph book, and behind Mal Griffiths' shoulder you can see the handle of a snow rake, because the snow outside was very deep on the pitch. A few weeks after this photograph was taken, Mal Griffiths was selected for Wales and became Leicester City's first post-war international. In January 1948, very unusual day in the history of the transfer market, because on that day, and this must be a club record, 5 Leicester City players all left the club on the same day to sign for the same club, Watford. And here you have the 5 players, Cheney, Eggleston, Hartley, Calvert and Osborne, on their last day at Leicester City, shaking hands with Johnny Duncan, the manager. In May 1948, a journalist called Noel Torberton wrote a very useful little history of Leicester City to that date. It was called From Foster City, and it's a useful source for current day historians. The 1948-49 season was the big season in the club's history because they got to the FA Cup final, but it's worth noticing before we get on to that was also the first season that Leicester City wore a fox's head on the club shirt as a club crest. The very first fox's head club crest worn for that season, this design was worn for that season only, was this red fox's head surrounded by the letters LCFC. We also unearthed at Peckleton Manor the original concept drawing for the fox's head, and the artist's concept is illustrated here, and this picture is the one that formed the basis of the club's crest for several years to come. Leicester City's achievement in reaching their FA Cup final in 1949 was made all the more remarkable by the fact that for most of that season they'd been struggling towards the bottom of the second division. The route to Wembley wasn't easy. In the third round it had taken 2 replays before Birmingham City were overcome in a tie which was watched by an aggregate crowd of over 108,000. An action shot from that third round tie can be seen here. The 5th round tie against Luton Town was even more remarkable in a way, because that tie saw a total of 18 goals being scored, 6 of them scored by Jack Lee, seen here. The first game at Luton was a 5-5 draw. Leicester won the second game 5-3. The semi-final against Portsmouth was also a remarkable victory. Portsmouth were that season's league champions. The semi-final was held at Highbury in front of the presence of Field Marshal Montgomery, and against all of the odds, Leicester City won that game with Don Revie scoring twice in a 3-1 victory. We have in the club's collection the programme for that match. We also have a VIP version with a blue ribbon attached to it. The photograph at kick-off is also part of the club's collection. You can see the crowd at Highbury at the moment of kick-off. And we also have several action photographs from that game, including this one here. It's worth noting, of course, that Leicester City in that game wore a white shirt. The Leicester Mercury produced this souvenir booklet once they'd got through the semi-final, detailing all of the games that Leicester had won on the way to the FA Cup final. The final was against Wolverhampton Wanderers. Wolves were to be runners-up the following season in the Old First Division, so they were a big side, and Leicester were distinct outsiders. The cup final squad can be seen in this photograph, but two of the team pictured here were actually missing for the final. Ian McGraw, the goalkeeper, was injured the week after the semi-final. His hand was damaged and in the end he had to have a finger amputated, and the other player missing was the star Don Revie, the scorer of the two goals at Portsmouth, who had such a bad nosebleed that it was life-threatening, and he spent the day of the final in hospital in Leicester. And so it was then that on April the 30th, 1949, Leicester City met Wolverhampton Wanderers at Wembley in front of a crowd of 100,000 people. We have many items relating to this final in the club's collection. One of the items is this postcard, which shows the players from both sides. It was a commemorative postcard, souvenir postcard produced before the game. It makes you realise what a strong side Wolves had. They'd got England internationals Bert Williams, Billy Wright, Jimmy Mullen, Jesse Pye, who scored 2 goals in the cup final in Wolves' 3-1 win, and also Sam Smythe, the Northern Ireland international, who scored another goal in the cup final. On the Leicester side, you've got Gordon Bradley, the reserve goalkeeper, who had come in for Ian McGraw. You'd got Jimmy Harrison. Now, he was normally a fullback, but he played in the unaccustomed position of centre forward in that game to cover for the absence of Don Revie. The side had to reshuffle. You've also got Norman Plummer, the captain. You've got Mel Griffiths, who scored Leicester's first ever goal at Wembley. He scored in the 3-1 defeat by Wolves in that cup final. We also have a programme, or several programmes from that cup final. They are of a standard design. The cover of all Wembley programmes in those days for internationals and for cup finals all tended to be very similar. The programme cost £1, which is the equivalent of 5p. You can see the twin towers of the what was then called the Empire Stadium, and you'll also notice from the picture that the two ends of the ground were uncovered. We have tickets from the final. This one is a more expensive one. It was a seated ticket. In the South Stand it cost 10 and 6, which is the equivalent of 52.5p, but that was relatively quite an expensive ticket for that particular final. We also have this silk headscarf. This measures 36 inches by 30 inches. They were presented to the wives of the players and the directors. On the headscarf are printed cartoon images of the players by a firm called Veris Colour in Leicester, and also you can see the results of the matches in the cup run which took Leicester City to Wembley. We also have a lot of photographs in our collection. This particular one here is a great photograph of the crowd in one of the uncovered ends at the stadium. You can see from the scoreboard the slogan encouraging people to save, which reminds people that the country was very much still in the grip of post-war austerity. Another photograph we have is of the players being led out by the managers and the captains. On this picture from left to right you've got Stan Cullis, the Wolves manager, Billy Wright, the Wolves captain, Norman Plummer, the Leicester City captain, and Johnny Duncan, the Leicester manager. Behind Johnny Duncan you can just see the goalkeeper Gordon Bradley, and you can also see fullbacks Ted Jelly and Sandy Scott, both of whom had only really made their position, got their position in the side halfway through the season. We have also displayed at the club Norman Plummer's Gold Runners-Up medal, which has been very kindly loaned to the club by Norman's family, along with other items of memorabilia relating to Norman's career. We have a souvenir booklet called The Wembley Story, published by the Leicester Mercury, which tells the story of the cup final itself. We also have menus from the post-final banquet at Mayfair Hotel in London. Here is the menu card together with signatures of the players written on the back of it. When they returned to Leicester on the Sunday, the next week was manic. They had to play 3 games in 4 days in order to prevent being relegated to the 3rd Division. They had to play away at Bury on the Wednesday. They won that game. They had to play at home the next day, the Thursday, against West Brom, and they lost that one 3-0. And this meant that on the final Saturday of the season, a week after the cup final, they had to get at least a point at Cardiff in order to keep out of the 3rd Division. Jack Lee's late equaliser secured the 1-1 draw that was necessary, and it was Nottingham Forest that went down rather than Leicester City. On the Monday after that Saturday, there was an open-top bus tour through the city and a celebration dinner hosted by the Lord Mayor. We have the menu from that celebration dinner here, together with, if you look inside, you've got the same cartoons that were on the silk headdress republished in this menu for this celebration, this celebratory dinner. So, at the end of the decade, they were gallant but beaten cup finalists. They had maintained their position in the 2nd Division, having narrowly escaped relegation to the 3rd. Next time, we'll look at the 1950s. This was a period of 2 promotions, one of them record-breaking. It was the decade of the phenomenal goal-scoring feats of Arthur Rowley, and it was also the decade in which, towards the end of it, new stars, for example Gordon Banks, Frank McClintock, Richie Norman, John Schoberg, Colin Appleton, Howard Riley, were beginning to make their mark as youngsters in the side. Until next week, look forward to seeing you then. Take care. Bye.